I would like to discuss a problem that we as clinical nephrologists are confronted with on a daily basis, that is how to deal with vitamin K antagonists in dialysis. And I would like to make the analogy with Odysseus, who on his way back to Ithaca had to navigate in between two terrible sea monsters in the Strait of Messina. On the Italian peninsula side there was Scylla, a terrible sea monster with 6 snake heads and shark-like teeth, and she devoured whatever ventured within reach, including a couple of Odysseus' men, as you can see here on the slide. And on the Sicilian side, on the Sicilian shore, there was Charybdis, a gigantic whirlpool that drank down and belched forth the waters several times a day. Now, the trick to survive is to find out which of the monsters is the worst and to avoid that one. Now, the way I see it, the Scylla in dialysis is a high prevalence of atrial fibrillation and the associated risk of stroke and systemic embolism. And this slide shows you here the distribution according to age, category, and region. And here for comparison, the prevalence in the general US population. Now, knowing in my country that the main age of patients on dialysis is 74 years, it doesn't come as a surprise that the prevalence of atrial fibrillation in our country is 25%. Now, I haven't found numbers for Chile, but taking into account that the average age on dialysis in Chile is 54 years, it probably would be like 10% of atrial fibrillation in Chilean dialysis patients. And the prevalence is rising, obviously, because we're treating older dialysis patients with more comorbidities, with more heart failure. But even if you adjust not only for age and for gender, but also for dialysis vintage and for all available indicators of comorbidity, there still appears to be a rising trend of atrial fibrillation in dialysis. Now, while in the normal population, the benefits of warfarin outweigh the risks. If you give warfarin to 1,000 patients for a year, you will prevent 23 strokes and cause 9 major hemorrhages, but still the balance is positive. This may not be the case in dialysis patients. And the way I see it, I think the Charybdis in dialysis is probably the vitamin K antagonists, the silent killer, the danger underneath the surface. If you look at all the trials that have studied the effects of warfarin in dialysis patients, you see that there are as many that show a benefit as there are that show no benefit or even harm. So we don't know whether warfarin really prevents stroke in dialysis patients. Of course, all these trials were observational studies. There's no randomized controlled trials available, so that we don't really know what we can conclude from these studies. Now, in addition, there's evidence that in patients with renal failure, they have a higher tendency to have a major bleeding with warfarin as compared to those patients that have a better renal function, even if PT is within target. We know that dialysis patients are more prone to have their PT outside the therapeutic window, but even if it's within the therapeutic window, they have a higher prevalence of major bleeding. And finally, and here the monster really shows its teeth, there's an association between vitamin K antagonists and vascular calcifications. We know that the factors of coagulation, they need to be carboxylated in order to become activated. And for this reaction, you need vitamin K. And then the vitamin K needs to be recycled back in order to continue the carboxylation. Now, it's this epoxide reductase enzyme that is blocked by the vitamin K antagonists, by warfarin. Now, we know now, since a few years, that it's not only the factors of coagulation and the inhibitors of coagulation that need to become carboxylated, but also matrix GLA protein, which is the most potent local inhibitor of ectopic calcification that is known, and is produced by the vascular smooth muscle cells. This matrix GLA protein, in its inactive form, is uncarboxylated, and it also needs to be carboxylated in order to become active. So that this mechanism is really at play in vivo was demonstrated by this experiment here in mice. If you give them warfarin for a number of weeks, then you see that the active form of matrix GLA protein is decreasing, the carboxylated form, and the inactive form of matrix GLA protein is increasing. And since this matrix GLA protein is an inhibitor of calcifications, you see that this process is associated with development of vascular calcifications in the media here and here in the intima. This is then a study in humans where they demonstrated that those patients that are taking vitamin K antagonists, and especially those that are taking it for more than 5 years, that they have more vascular calcifications as compared to those that are not taking it. Obviously, this is an observational study, and these patients, they are not the same profile. They have more comorbid conditions, they are older, they have more heart failure, etc. So they have more risk factors for vascular calcifications per se. So we don't really know what we can conclude from such observational studies. So taken together, if you look at the evidence, and it's all indirect evidence, only observational studies, no randomized controlled trials, but if you look at the evidence, we don't really know whether warfarin prevents stroke in dialysis patients. We know from studies that patients on dialysis have an increased risk of major bleeding on warfarin, and importantly, there's a biological plausibility, there is experimental animal evidence, and there's indirect clinical evidence that warfarin increases vascular calcifications in dialysis patients. So here you see the innocent dialysis patient sailing by, unaware of the true dimensions of the monster underneath the surface. The second point I would like to make is that dialysis is a vitamin K deficient state. And this here is an allegory for the relationship between a nephrologist and a poor dialysis patient, because we make them eat a diet that is low in potassium, low in phosphate, low in salt, and therefore extremely deficient in vitamin K. We, with our group, have measured the intake of vitamin K in our dialysis patient. Vitamin K1, phylloquinone, which is especially found in leafy green vegetables, which they're not allowed to eat. And vitamin K2, menaquinone, which is especially found in fermented foods like cheese, which they're also not allowed to eat. And you see, if you look at the intake of vitamin K1 and K2, it's much lower than in the average population. And our findings correspond very well with that of another study done in the Netherlands, where they also find a very deficient intake of vitamin K1 and K2 in dialysis patients. Now, in our study, we didn't find any correlation between the intake of vitamin K1 and the inactive form of matrix GLA protein, but we did find a negative correlation between the intake of vitamin K2 and the inactive form of matrix GLA protein. So theoretically, if you adhere to your low phosphate diet in order to prevent vascular calcifications from the phosphate, then you eat less vitamin K2, then your matrix GLA protein inactive levels are increasing, and so you're more prone to developing vascular calcifications. So you can never win if you're a dialysis patient. But there's more to this than just diet. This study looked here at the levels of inactive form of matrix GLA protein in different degrees of renal failure. And you see that the more the kidney function declines, the higher the inactive form of matrix GLA protein. We also found a relationship, a positive correlation between dialysis vintage and the inactive form of matrix GLA protein. So the longer you're on dialysis, the higher the inactive levels of matrix GLA protein. And this recently came out indicating that uremia by itself may have a negative effect on the vitamin K cycle. So this is an experimental uremic model where they measured the levels of gamma-glutamyl carboxylase, which is one of the key enzymes from the vitamin K cycle, and it's profoundly affected by uremia itself, although it wasn't clear from the experiments why that might be the case. So we know, first of all, that vitamin K antagonists may have the potential to induce vascular calcifications. And secondly, we know that dialysis by itself is a vitamin K deficient state. So we thought maybe we're going to set up a randomized controlled trial in dialysis patients that have to take warfarin because they have atrial fibrillation. And we would randomize them into 3 groups. In one group, we continue warfarin, which is still the standard therapy. In another group, we would replace warfarin by something else. And in the third group, we would replace warfarin by something else and give additional vitamin K. And then see what happens with the vascular calcifications that we measure with the coronary artery calcification scoring, with the CT scan, and with the pulse wave analysis measurements. Now, the first question we needed to ask is, which vitamin K are we going to give? Because there's several. You have the vitamin K1, especially found in green vegetables, and then you have several vitamin K2s in fermented foods. So this here is a study done a few years back where they gave equimolar amounts of MK7, which is vitamin K2, and vitamin K1, which we use routinely in our patients if we want to correct coagulation status. And you see that in equimolar amounts, the vitamin K2 has a more efficient effect on the vitamin K levels in the serum and on the carboxylation ratio of osteocalcin. So it appears to be more efficient, the vitamin K2. So we decided to use vitamin K2 for our study. But the next question, of course, was how much vitamin K2 are we going to give? Because there's no data available. There's no data that determine which dose of vitamin K2 has the most efficient effect. So therefore, we performed this dose-finding study in dialysis patients, and we randomized patients into 3 groups with increasing doses of vitamin K2. For comparison, these are absolutely pharmacological doses. If you see it in the healthy population, the average intake is only 31 micrograms. So in the highest dose, we gave 1,080 micrograms. But also for comparison, 1 ampulla of Conacion, I don't know what the name is in Chile, but Conacion, this is 10 milligrams, so it's even 10 times higher as the highest dose of vitamin K that we are going to give. And these are the results. There was a linear dose response. So the higher the dose of vitamin K2, the more pronounced the decrease of the inactive form of matrix GLA protein. Now, there's 3 observations that we could make. First of all, there were no biochemical non-responders, indicating that all dialysis patients have a severe functional vitamin K deficiency. All patients that got the vitamin K, that actually took the vitamin K2, all of them individually had a decrease in their matrix GLA protein levels. So they all responded. Second observation is that there's no plateau phase. And the third observation is, even with the highest dose that we gave, the resultant levels of matrix GLA protein are still way higher than that of the healthy population. So probably we need to give even higher doses, maybe like 1,500 or 2,000 micrograms of vitamin K2 in order to have an efficient effect. The third question we needed to ask is, replace warfarin with what? What are we going to give to anticoagulate our patients? Fortunately, in the past few years, we've seen the development of several oral anticoagulants. We have the anti-factor 10A antagonists, rivaroxaban, apixaban, edoxaban, and we have the anti-factor 2A antagonist, dabigatran. Now, to cut a long story short, we've chosen rivaroxaban, which has demonstrated very good results in atrial fibrillation patients that were published a few years back in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was a rocket trial. You see that rivaroxaban is equally or more effective than warfarin in patients with non-valvular atrial fibrillation, and it causes less major bleeding. So it is, I think, a reliable molecule in atrial fibrillation, and also for the other indications for which it is used, like the prevention and treatment of venous thromboembolism and pulmonary embolism. It has been tested in very large randomized controlled trials that were published in top clinical journals, and it always demonstrated a very good effect. It was either equally or more effective, or it demonstrated equal or less bleeding as compared to the low molecular weight heparins or the vitamin K antagonists. So I think rivaroxaban is a molecule with very good clinical experience, a molecule that can be relied upon. But the problem is, as always, there's no clinical experience in patients with a creatinine clearance below 30. I've checked all the method sections from these papers, and each paper systematically, like all new molecules that are developed, they exclude patients with renal failure. So there is no clinical experience, at least no published clinical experience in patients with a creatinine clearance below 30. We know that the clearance of rivaroxaban is partially by the kidney, to a small extent by glomerular filtration, and mainly by tubular secretion. These are the indications for which it is used. Prevention of deep venous thromboembolism, you give 10 milligrams once daily. Treatment of venous thromboembolism, of pulmonary embolism, first you give 30 milligrams, then 20 milligrams once daily. And then the indication that interests us, prevention of stroke. There the company makes the distinction between patients with a creatinine clearance above 50, then you give the standard dose, or with a creatinine clearance between 15 and 49, you give a reduced dose of 15 milligrams. It's officially contraindicated in patients with creatinine clearance below 15 for lack of data. The 15 here is remarkable because, as you've seen, the company doesn't have any published clinical experience in patients with creatinine clearance below 30, but still they advocate this on their websites. So we thought, well, let's set up our own dose finding study and see which dose we can reliably and safely give in dialysis patients. So we have given 10 milligrams, a single dose in 12 chronic hemodialysis patients after the dialysis session, and then followed up the levels for the subsequent 44 hours up to the next dialysis level. We did this twice and then made the mean. And these are the curves that we've obtained. We measured the anti-10A activities with the commercially available kit, and our laboratory also set up a modified HPLC method in order to measure the molecule itself, and you can see that there's a very good correspondence between the two methods. In red here, these are the results that we've obtained with 10 milligrams of rivaroxaban, and these are the results from the only published pharmacological study with rivaroxaban in patients with renal failure. They also gave 10 milligrams, and you see that our results are very much in line with those findings. These are our results, and we've compared them 10 milligrams in hemodialysis patients with 20 milligrams in healthy controls. You see that the area under the curve is very similar. The peak is obviously lower, but the clearance is slower, so therefore you have the same exposure to the molecule. So I think 10 milligrams in dialysis patients, I think you're on the safe side. It can be used. A separate analysis to test the effect of dialysis on rivaroxaban levels. As you can see, there's none, which could be predicted by the very high protein binding of rivaroxaban, but now we know for sure. So this is pretty much what the trial will look like in patients that are on a vitamin K antagonist. Because they have atrial fibrillation in dialysis, we will randomize them into 3 groups. In one group, we will just continue the vitamin K antagonists according to standard procedures. Second group, we will replace the warfarin by rivaroxaban 10 milligrams once daily, which we believe can be safely used as an adequate dose in dialysis patients. And then in the third group, we will give the rivaroxaban and an additional dose of vitamin K to supplement the deficiency that we see in all dialysis patients. And then we see what is going to happen with the vascular calcifications. Now, if everything goes well, we'll have the beginning of an answer in about 3 years, because this is obviously how long such a trial will take. And in the meantime, we need a strategy for our patients. So I thought we might learn from how Odysseus has solved the problem. He knew that if he came too close to Charybdis, that the entire vessel would be sucked to the bottom of the sea and everybody would be destroyed. And if you look at the satellite picture of the Strait of Messina, you see that the whirlpool is actually there. It does exist. Coming too close to Scylla, which in reality is a very sharp rock formation here on the coast of Calabria, this would maybe cost him a couple of men, but the odds were good that the rest of the crew would make it through. And this is what he did. He navigated the ship as far away from Charybdis as possible. He brushed past Scylla. 6 of his men were eaten alive, but the rest of the crew made it through. So now you will ask me, what does this mean? How does this translate into the care of dialysis patients with atrial fibrillation? Well, I think we have to navigate away from the vitamin K antagonists. The vitamin K antagonists are Charybdis, the danger underneath the surface, the silent killer, the vascular calcifications that kill our patients. While the Scylla is the more visible danger, the stroke and systemic embolism. But I think we need to navigate away from the vitamin K antagonists, and this may cost us a couple of patients that will develop a stroke. But hopefully, the rest of the crew will make it through. Thank you.
So, Anne, thank you for your beautiful presentation. So, as always, question to you. So, what about the what about the inability of the platelets to work well in patients on dialysis?
Well, that's indeed the point that we're struggling with, because dialysis patients, this is the unique situation where you have both an increased tendency for bleeding because of the platelet problems and the exposure to the low molecular weight heparins that we are giving during dialysis. So an increased tendency to bleeding on the one hand, but also an increased tendency for thromboembolic phenomena that, well, you know, the risk of stroke is severely increased in dialysis patients, etc. So we're dealing with this unique situation where we have to navigate between two bad things, and we don't know which direction we have to take.
And great talk, thank you. I just have a question. All atrial fibrillation patients are not created equal. We know there are some atrial fibrillation patients that have higher risk of stroke versus other patients that have a much lower. Are you planning to stratify based on the risk of potential complications?
Well, the CHEST-FAST score that you're probably referring to has not been validated in dialysis patients. So we don't know whether we have to stratify according to that. But what you're saying is right. Not all atrial fibrillation patients are created equal. And especially in dialysis, it's not clear whether atrial fibrillation patients have a higher risk of stroke because apparently dialysis patients as a group, they have a severely increased risk of stroke, but it's not different between those with atrial fibrillation and those without. So we don't really know whether that is a true risk factor in dialysis patients.
I wonder, what do you think about the utilization of aspirin in dialysis patients?
Well, you're probably aware of the fact that there's been a Cochrane review recently on the use of aspirin and platelet inhibitors in dialysis patients, and it's again this balance that we were discussing. They decrease the risk a little bit, but they increase the risk of bleeding severely. So it's again this balance that we don't know. And there's no randomized controlled trials in dialysis patients that guide us.
Muchas gracias, doctora de Vriese.